Hey everyone, Eric here, excited to share with you some of my notes. As I always say, this is not meant to be exhaustive, but some just high level views of the book of Proverbs as I've just been able to wrestle with the content and really just kind of take a microscope to it over the last 4 or 5 months. I actually checked when I started studying was back in May, and now it's October. So um, these are what I would consider some highlights and some great takeaways for you as you're teaching through the book of Proverbs to supplement your study. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. Bear with me. This is the English Standards um, summary of Proverbs. It says Proverbs is practical wisdom for living is the central concern of the book of Proverbs. Practical wisdom for living is the central concern for the book of Proverbs. So I think that's just great to kind of get us started. I think that Proverbs is a very different genre from a lot of the other different parts of scripture, and it's just very practical. And a lot of them a lot of the Proverbs we can kind of see a deeper meaning there, but there is also an original sort of just basic practical meaning for wisdom just for everyday life, and that's what Proverbs is about. Um, let's look at the structure of the book of Proverbs. There's different ways of looking at this, and as you may have seen, actually I didn't put it there yet. I'll show you at the end who I got most of this information from. But one way of looking at the structure is in 4 parts. First, the Book of Solomon, which is the majority of Book of Proverbs, chapters 1 through 24. And that could be divided into 3 parts. The first part being discourse. If you notice, the first 9 chapters of Proverbs are not typically what we think of as Proverbs. And so we call this section really discourse or a sermon or a speech. And then you come to the actual Proverbs, which are usually 1 to 2 line statements or sayings. And then you have the longer sayings in chapter 22 through 24, where you have multiple lines and sometimes 5, 6 lines right before you get to this second section, which we could call Hezekiah, chapters 25 through 29. And this is where it says Hezekiah copied the words of Solomon. We also have some new Proverbs in there. We have some repeats from the first section as well. And then you have the sayings of Augur, and then you have the sayings of Lemuel. Not much is actually known about these 2 figures except what we have here, which is interesting. Those are the 4 sections, and again, I'm getting most of the info from today from Dwayne A. Garrett's commentary on Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs, volume 14, from the New American Commentary. So I want to give him credit, and I did look at a few other sources, but this is the main one that I used. Notice I bolded here chapter 10, verse 1, chapter 22, verse 1, and chapter 24, verse 23 all have headings that are the same. So that's one of the reasons why this structure is, we're looking at the structure this way, is because even the beginning of these chapters, you could see, like, obviously the first part of the book is the first section. The second part, beginning with chapter 10, starts a new heading, and the headings are words of the wise. And so that only shows up in those spots, chapter 10, 22, and 24, before the section on Hezekiah. And so that's why, even the book itself sort of divides itself in those parts. Here's a quote from Dwayne Greer on the date. I thought this was helpful. Majority of Proverbs, particularly the book of Solomon, chapters 1 through 24, may be confidently ascribed to the early monarchy. So we're talking about David, Solomon during their actual lives, on the basis of the evidence of the text itself and structural considerations. So That's it for I have for date. And then just a map of the region. So you're thinking about King Solomon's reign and him being in Jerusalem here, and the different places that may be mentioned. You have Midian in the south, of course, Egypt to the southwest, Arabia out here, Ophir, Sheba, somewhere in the south. You can see there's a little question mark there. Scholars aren't completely sure, but we have things that mention Ophir in 1 Kings 9:28. So I put that in there. They brought it to King Solomon, and then you have the queen in the south, and things like that we know about. So this is kind of a map of some of the cities and during the time of Solomon. So let's look at some major purposes here. I'm just going to read this because this is a great quote. But in the view of the current moral climate of society and even the church, we're in desperate need of the instruction offered by these books. In an age when seduction, domestic conflict, financial mismanagement, substance abuse, and dishonesty often seem to be behavioral norms, we must allow the Spirit to transform us with truths from biblical wisdom. So that's just kind of emphasizing why we need Proverbs. Like, what is unique about Proverbs? And I think it does address just head on some of those things that are mentioned there. Also, wisdom literature addresses these practical, ordinary issues of life, like I mentioned in the beginning. And one example is social skills. Another is financial prudence. Another is personal discipline. And so you don't see that a lot elsewhere in Scripture. And so this is addressing, again, these very ordinary issues of life. And then also the family. So I'll read this also. The family, rather than the school, is everywhere presented as the primary place of training. Nevertheless, as Proverbs explicitly states, Israelite wisdom literature was a product of the royal court and its scribes. So this is kind of an interesting balance, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but Proverbs amazingly talks a lot about the poor and talks a lot about the ordinary. It's addressing the common person. It's coming from the royal court. And so you have that aspect of it that's not forgotten. But really, the family is presented as this primary place of training, and so I think, as we're applying that to our own lives, I think even when we're thinking about public school versus homeschool, I'm not going to say one is necessarily better than the other, even though I have my own biases. But at the end of the day, as a Christian, we still have to say that the primary place of training, even if we no matter where we send our kids or what we do with our children as parents, still the primary place of training is the home, according to Proverbs, which is God's word to us. Even from the position of the state, which would have been at the time Solomon, so there's this, and it's coming from the state, but then again, the state being, God's people, it wasn't secular at the same time. So even though it was coming from the state, this is coming from a state that was directed by God's own people. And so there's this, there's just tension there that we kind of have to hold both of those truths, that no matter what we do, that we see the family as the primary place of training and primary responsibility, right? As parents, we don't just let other people teach our children. We have to be primarily responsible for their education, no matter what we do. So I spent a long time in that, obviously passionate about that, but agree with Dwayne Garrett on that. Let's talk about some of the theology in the book. So there's this question of, what is going on with some of the Proverbs, because it's considering nature, and it doesn't always mention God, but God is the sort of the understood, or the given, or the assumed underlying everything. And so really it's thinking about science and submission to God, but it's not primarily about science. So reverence for God is what determines progress in Proverbs. And this is just a quote that's summarizing what I just said, but that as these sages, they were participants in this wider intellectual journey. And so, Solomon would consider himself part of the, the larger investigation into the world, but it was all from the idea of being in submission to God. So I thought that was important to bring up. Secondly, there's this idea that you may come across as you're reading through Proverbs where it sounds like, is this retribution from God, or is this just a natural consequence we're talking about? Is it even like karma, where we think that, in the world has this idea that, if you do something bad, something bad is going to happen to you. If you do something good's going to happen to you, but it's absent of any sort of divine intervention. It's just what happens in the universe. But Proverbs, I like this where Dwayne Garrett says it's uniquely Israelite, and it's in agreement with the Torah. So it's not simply act consequence, but if you look at the book as a whole, it's really, again, with the assumed position that God is behind everything. And then relationship to the rest of the Old Testament, like I said, Proverbs is unique in its genre. It's wisdom literature, so it's not narrative. It's not didactic like Genesis and teaching us, theology, or like the law in Deuteronomy teaching us, very explicitly, God's commands and things like that. And I wrote that it's really the converse of something like Deuteronomy. Whereas, we ask, is Proverbs about salvation and Jesus? Well, I'd have to say the whole Bible is, but Proverbs less explicitly so. And like I said in the beginning, it's more about practical living. But there is a way in which a lot of these, it's like, are about Christ. Even Jesus would say, and said, as he's training the disciples, after his resurrection on the road to Emmaus, and he shows them how all of the scriptures apply to him. But whereas Deuteronomy, for example, its main thing is calling the person to love, and then there's some practical guidance in there. Proverbs is sort of the flip of that, or the converse of that. So Proverbs is really the sage counseling the disciple to begin the quest of discernment by submitting to God. So it's sort of the before you get there sort of thing. It's talking about practical living, and it's also pointing us to God. And then Deuteronomy is more specific, how we're to live and to love God. So here's another question. Does Proverbs teach or endorse a theology that asserts that the rich are righteous and favored by God, but the poor are evil, lazy, and only getting what they deserve? So I thought that was a valid question, because you could sometimes get that impression from some of the way that the Proverbs are written. But again, Proverbs is really giving us general truth, right? So they're short, they're pithy statements, and they would have also distracted from the attention given to the didactic purposes if we had to spend time explaining. Really, the shortness of the verse is powerful, right? It's like it's aimed like a rifle more than a shotgun, and it gets straight to the point. And so even though, again, it's general truth, it's generally true that those who live lives of integrity will be prosperous. It's generally true that those who are lazy and untrustworthy are going to destroy themselves. But we know that there's exceptions to that, right? All right. And just again, lastly, I already touched a little bit about this, but the message of education. We see that, for example, patriotism is obviously, as you read through Proverbs, not evil. You talk about the king and how we should honor the king and things like that. But there's no attempt made to glorify the Israelite culture. It's all about God. It's all about the Lord. So maybe a proverb that summarizes this is 14:34. Righteousness exalts a nation. So righteousness, that word is very much tied to the covenant with Abraham and right standing before God. And then the rest of the proverb says, but sin is a disgrace to any people. So again, not prioritizing Israel, but sin is a disgrace to any people. And that word people is also a packed word referring to the nations, peoples of the earth. And so Israel is not idolized. And also interestingly, you might think that coming from the royal state, coming from the palace, you might hear more of promoting a particular occupation or trade, and that doesn't happen in Proverbs. And again, education is clearly the task of the parents, the responsibility of parents. And then also we see this stress on the limitations of our wisdom. So it's not praising man and all of our accomplishments and what we're able to do, but actually stresses how we are in desperate need of God for knowledge. All right, so some patterns in wisdom. I put this together. Don't be overwhelmed. This is a lot of different words, but I thought this was fun just to see the types of proverbs, because you may not realize there's lots of different kinds. With monocolon versus bicolon, we're just saying, there's one line versus two line proverbs. There's triplets, there's quatrains, there's pentads, hexads. That just means 3, 4, 5, 6 lines or more. Excuse me. And so you can see, if you want to pause the video, you can see some of those proverbs I put out there. But this is one proverb here with lines A and B. And this is one proverb, 3 lines, this tricolon. Do you see a man skillful in his work? You will stand before kings. You will not stand before obscure men. So you also have 4-liners, and I put this AB pattern here, showing that, sometimes they are parallel this way, whether it's rhyming or the way that the word is structured, the sentence is structured. And it may be AABB for the line, all 4 lines. It could be ABAC, a completely different line. And then you have proverbs of 5 lines and more. So I just thought that would be interesting to show you that. These tricolons, quatrains, pentads are sometimes called sayings over proverbs, because like I mentioned here, the bicolon or the couplet is by far the most common pattern in Proverbs. And then let's look at some forms. So as I mentioned, saying is usually something that has more than a couple lines, but it refers to all Proverbs. And sometimes, a line in the Bible, like 1 Samuel 18:7, it kind of feels like a proverb. It's not really teaching so much as it is a statement, and it's memorable. So like Saul has his thousands and David his tens of thousands. That was the song sung by the women in praise of David. But then you have actual proverbs, but all those might be under this sort of grouping of sayings. And then this is just a definition of what a proverb is. So in short, it's an ethical axiom. And then if you want a longer definition, it's a short, artistically constructed ethical observation or teaching. So I thought that was helpful. Now let's look at some of the other forms. We talked about the saying and the proverbs, but there's also admonition. So I really just like how I'm about to point out here how these are different, and I loved learning about this from Dwayne Garrett. But they're not, Proverbs is very complex. It's not the word I'm looking for, but just rich. It's not simply one kind of proverb, but we have admonition. So it's commanding us to do something. We have a numerical saying, like there are 3 things that are too amazing for me, and then they're listed. There's a rhetorical question. there's poem, there's exhortation, there's appeal, there's a speech, there's a story, there's confession and reflection in Proverbs, there's riddle, there's even allegory. So we have all these things going on in Proverbs, and it just makes it really rich, really interesting. You have an observational proverb. So, and there's lots of these, right? It's like you read it and you go, what am I supposed to do with that? It doesn't tell you explicitly. It just states what's true. One man pretends to be rich, yet has nothing. Another pretends to be poor, yet has great wealth. So these are meant for us to meditate on and to think about, because it's not explicitly told what we're supposed to think about them. And that's part of what makes Proverbs so great. You also have rhetorical devices, and these are also just interesting to think about. Some of this is lost on us because we don't speak the original Hebrew language, and so we're not seeing assonance, for example, which is really it's like rhyming, or the first part of the words sounding the same. And that would have occurred in Proverbs 10:9, Proverbs 13:20, for example. You have alliteration where, the first part of the words are all the same. So I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but if everything started with T, that'd be alliteration. And then you have plays on words. This is an example of a play on words in Proverbs. So a pun. Make no friendship with a man given to anger, nor go with a wrathful man, lest you learn his ways and entangle yourself in a snare. So what's lost on us there is that the word anger also can mean nose. And nose is understood to be associated with a snare or bait. You could see that clearly in a verse like Isaiah, where it says, because of your rage and arrogance against me, because your rage and arrogance against me have reached my ears, I'll put a hook or snare in your nose and my bit in your mouth. I will send you back the way you came. So you could see those things are associated with one another. But that would have been, that's kind of lost on us in English, if that's true. But you have plays on words. You even have rhyme. So Proverbs 11:12 says, Bazadon Yavo Cologne. So very easy probably to remember something that rhymes. In English, we just have when pride comes, then comes disgrace. So if we were to hear that, maybe a similar way of putting that would be, when pride fills your face, then comes disgrace. Something that would have been memorable because it rhymed. You also have humor and irony. So you may remember 11:22, like a gold ring and a pig's snout is a beautiful woman without discretion. And I remember the first time I read that, I'm kind of like, huh, what does that mean? If you just think about it, it could kind of make you laugh, because obviously the gold ring is beautiful, so that's being likened to a beautiful woman. But then all of a sudden you picture that in a pig snout, and that golden ring isn't so beautiful anymore. And it maybe kind of make you laugh because of how giant that pig is compared to that ring. You also have 19:24, the sluggard buries his hand in the dish and will not even bring it back to his mouth. So just highlighting, laziness. And it's kind of funny. It's like, no, that probably doesn't happen a lot. It's maybe some exaggeration going on there. It's supposed to make you maybe laugh a little bit, but just highlighting laziness in a humorous way. You have some homograph. So here's another one with the word af. For pressing of milk produces curds, pressing the nose produces blood, and pressing anger produces strife. And I tried to put in the Hebrew there so you could see pressing the nose, af, pressing anger, afim. So there's, this, it's spelled the same, but there's the different meaning. And could be compared to, these aren't actual proverbs, but maybe a way of showing you what that's like, because it's the same word here, running and running, but it's two different meanings. Running a race builds endurance, but running from problems builds anxiety. You don't actually literally run from problems, but it's a way of describing it, and it's an easy way of memorizing that. So same way, reading a book gives knowledge, reading a person reveals character. So again, those aren't actual proverbs, just kind of ways of seeing what we're talking about here with homograph. Here's a list of just some proverbs. If you want to pause the video or screenshot this, or take some of these, it's just kind of a cool index of some of the topics that Proverbs addresses. It's really, really amazing how we've got anger, children, contentment, courage, debt, dishonesty, envy, foolishness, friends, generosity, government, greed, honesty, humility, injustice, justice, laziness, marriage, neighbors, patience, poverty, pride, sexual immorality, wealth, work. So lots and lots of different topics in the book of Proverbs. We really don't see collected here like this in any other book of the Bible. And so let's just kind of move on. This is actually the last slide I had. And this for me was just really interesting, digging into this one, Proverbs 6:16. There are six things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him. And then specific things are listed there. And you can go and look that up. But it's a way of showing that the list, even though there's specific items on the list, it's not exhaustive. In other words, other things could be added to the list. It's also highlighting that, they're so severe. In other words, it's not like, we're not meant to do math and subtract and go, okay, there's 6 things that the Lord hates, but 7 are an abomination. An abomination sounds worse. So is there one thing in there that's not as bad as an abomination? That's not what's going on. So it's just using similar words, hates, abomination. Proverbs does that a lot, where it repeats the same thing in a different way. And so we're just supposed to see these as, hey, this is not an exhaustive list, but here are some specific things, and so yeah, we're not meant to do subtraction there, and that'll be helpful, looking at some other proverbs that are in the list in that way. All right, well, those are some of my notes from Proverbs. I hope this has helped some of you, and feel free to like, comment, share, and I hope this has been a blessing. Thanks.